The geopolitical implications of this are known, but the market implications, what are we seeing?
So what we're seeing is the immediate sell-off in risk assets and the flight to quality. Importantly, however, is what happens next. In the past, every escalation of the crisis in Ukraine has been shrugged off after an immediate sell-off, and has been shrugged off for good reasons. People believe that it's in nobody's interest for the situation to deteriorate faster. So it's going to be interesting as to whether we replay this process again this time around. We probably will, but we should not forget that every time we take a step closer to a tipping point.
Dr. El-Erian, good afternoon. Tom Keene here in New York. When I think of this tragedy, I think of your book, When Markets Collide, and your acclaimed phrase, the known unknown. What is the unknown right now for you when you see this news flow?
So the big unknown, Tom, is who's responsible. If it turns out that the responsibility can be pointed directly or indirectly to Russia, then the West will be under tremendous pressure to escalate the sanctions that were already stepped up yesterday. So the big unknown is who is responsible. And if Russia is shown to be responsible, then there is a higher probability of more sanctions from the West and then counter-sanctions from Russia. And that would mean a complete paradigm shift.
Within that, and what is so traffic, Mohammed, is, and I think of Aviation Weekly's article on General Petraeus' comments back in February, and the headline is, folks, commercial airliners need anti-missile protection. It's a wonderful article, and to quote the general, our worst nightmare was that a civilian airliner would be shot down by one. And there's a speculation over which kind of missile defense, and we'll all be smarter on that in the coming days. The singular distinction to me is a lot of experts have been thinking about this for a long time. Have you run into this debate before about surface-to-air missiles?
So I haven't directly run into the debate, but there are certain assumptions that we all operate on. And one of the assumptions is that commercial airliners, even when they fly over geopolitical hotspots, are safe. And should that assumption prove incorrect, you're talking about rerouting all sorts of planes. I mean, it would be significant. So as the news evolve, there may be a number of paradigm changes. But the biggest one right now for the markets is, does this lead to a step up in sanction? Because we've been on a path. First, sanction individuals in Russia, then start sanctioning companies, which was done again yesterday. And the next step, if it ever occurs, is sanctioning sectors as a whole, in particular finance and energy. And that would take the sanctions from being isolated to being systemic in nature for markets.
Dr. El-Erian, what does this mean for the energy markets now? What does this mean for the mindset of, I guess, in a war zone, in a theater of hostilities, airlines deciding that they can no longer fly those routes because they may not be safe enough?
So it means clearly more consumption, because you're going to have to have diversions around these zones. Already the U.S. has warned its own airlines about this possibility. Other countries did not take it seriously. So that's what it will mean. But the broader impact, again, is if it goes beyond the Ukraine. If it turns out that this escalates what I call the lose-lose-lose, where Ukraine is worse off, Russia is worse off, and the global economy is worse off.
You know, I gave a panel discussion this morning, Mohammed, here at our world headquarters, and one of the good questions I got was, what does Ukraine mean to the United States? Maybe we just found out, within the cacophony of international relations, in the set of multiple events that we have now, Mark, you and I could take 5 minutes just to list them, between Iran, between Iraq, with Syria, which is, you know, an article today of Syria literally being pushed to the back burner. What does this say about an exogenous event? This is truly an exogenous event for the United States, isn't it?
It is, and some people will tell you it speaks to a much bigger phenomenon, one that Tom Friedman has written about in the New York Times, which is that increasingly the marginal setter is the small actor rather than the state actor. So if it turns out that this is a missile fired by the rebels, right, suddenly you've gone from states controlling outcomes to individuals, well-organized individuals, having a huge impact. And that, again, is a significant shift. So there's a lot of unknown unknowns as well as known unknowns, and the news over the next few days is going to be particularly important.
Dr. El-Erian, what position then does this leave the new president of Ukraine, Poroshenko, in relation to the dynamic between President Obama and President Putin?
So he's going to have to figure out, okay, how he wants to react. If his airspace becomes dangerous, this is bad news for Ukraine in so many different ways. So it's really important to see how he reacts. Again, he needs to ascertain what actually happened. The worst thing that can happen right now is that everybody acts prematurely and then establishes facts on the ground that are difficult to reverse.
Well, you see the reaction here right now. This from Reuters coming across a Bloomberg terminal, Mark. Air France to avoid eastern Ukraine airspace. Sure, and it's really, again, as you or Mohammed mentioned earlier, this idea of we just assume 6 miles up flight over any form of dangerous territory is a safe flight.
Because
and that is
the reports were it was at cruising altitude, about what, 30,000?
Well, 33,000 feet up, as Michael McKee was mentioning earlier. Mohammed, when you look at this and you look at a G7 response, is there a G7 to respond to, or do you go with Ian Bremmer that it's a G0 world?
So increasingly, this is a G0 world in the sense that no single power or no group of countries can inform, influence, and even guarantee certain outcomes on the ground. I think the G7 here will be divided because the action that the G7 can take hurts the G7. The action that the G7 can take means intensify sanctions, go to sectors, target energy and finance in particular. But the problem with that is that you're likely to trigger counter-sanctions by Russia on energy supplies to Central and Western Europe. So it's a very difficult situation, and it is very hard for the G7 to unite. Already we've seen divisions within Europe on Russian sanctions, let alone between Europe and the U.S.